Welcome back to No Hut, everyone. The NBA Finals is officially under wraps. It was a very, very interesting series, to say the least. But of course, the New York Knicks are officially NBA champions, halting a drought of over 50 years, capping off an improbable, dominant, and very memorable playoff run overall. Just Jalen Brunson silencing all the doubters, becoming Finals MVP, having a really, really good series overall. And overall, this is just a season that Knicks fans will never forget, and I can only imagine the absolute feeling of euphoria that everyone in New York is feeling right now. But looking at the New York Knicks from a big picture perspective, I think it would be fun to look back at their entire 25-26 season, because one doesn't just simply win a championship like that. Overall, the Knicks had to face their fair share of struggles to get to this point. They were able to build a really, really good team. So overall, let's just talk about how the Knicks became the NBA champions. And our story goes all the way back to May of 2025, when the Knicks were bounced out of last year's playoffs by the Indiana Pacers in an overall very comfortable 6-game series. We all remember the infamous Game 1, where the Knicks choked in spectacular fashion. And overall, this was a very embarrassing exit by the New York Knicks, even though the Pacers had a really memorable playoff run, the Knicks were still the favorites going into this series. And this led to the dismissal of their head coach, Tom Thibodeau. Tibbs overall did a decent job of maximizing a little bit of the roster and going far in the playoffs, but seeing as how the roster definitely had a ceiling of something more, it felt like they needed new tactics, new culture, and a new voice to take this team to the promised land. Enter Mike Brown, who had finally been fired by the Sacramento Kings. He was brought in to change the culture and the philosophy of this Knicks roster. That was very promising. There was a fair share of upside and downside, as Mike Brown had obviously been really successful with the Kings for 1 year, but at the same time, he had been fired by said Kings, so we don't know if it was either a dumb decision by them or if Mike Brown wasn't that great. But overall, again, a lot of upside and a lot of downside with this new hire. Going into the season, the Knicks were one of the favorites to win the NBA championship due to a very wide-open Eastern Conference. Contenders like the Celtics were seen as taking a gap year due to the Tatum injury, and other teams like the Cavs or the Pistons weren't really seen as being serious contenders compared to the year before. So overall for the Knicks, this was a very golden opportunity to take the Eastern Conference by storm and be able to just kind of walk through to the NBA Finals due to a lot of the other opponents not being to the level of the New York Knicks. And in the regular season, they got off to a really, really good start. They went 24-9 up until the end of 2025. They're even able to pick up an NBA Cup win at the time against the San Antonio Spurs. And it looked like Mike Brown had finally led a really impressive turnaround. The Knicks were overall playing some pretty good basketball. They were showing signs of brilliance. And it looked like they were living up to potential of being that one team in the Eastern Conference that was just going to stand out and walk to the NBA Finals. That was until New Year's Eve of 2025, when the Knicks were hit with a very surprising free fall over the next couple of weeks. They went just 2-9 over their next 11 games, and overall they were struggling a lot, showing signs of that very flawed basketball team that they were showing when they were under Tibbs. And overall, the doubters were starting to creep in, as this was looking like the same old Knicks that would disappoint later in the postseason, just like 2024 and just like 2025. And overall, people were starting to count out the Knicks, especially with other teams in the Eastern Conference starting to emerge as maybe even being superior to them. Luckily, a stimulus package came in the form of the Brooklyn Nets. A 55-point blowout was exactly what the Knicks needed to get themselves back on track, and just like that, they were basically able to bounce back and just cruise through the rest of the regular season. They went 27-11 over their last 38 games, and overall, they showed some signs of being that premier team in the Eastern Conference. They had some signs of being a very unserious team, having some very dumb losses, but overall, they also had some signs of being a very good team with some very notable wins and some very memorable winning streaks. That was enough to get them 53 wins and the third seed in the Eastern Conference. And going into the NBA playoffs, the Knicks were definitely seen as one of the better teams in that conference and could definitely make it to the finals. But due to their past playoff failures, there were some doubters creeping, and people didn't really see the Knicks as a legitimate threat to not just win the Eastern Conference, but to win the entire NBA title. The first round would see them go up against the Atlanta Hawks, a very familiar foe without a certain Trae Young in the equation. And the Knicks flexed their muscles in Game 1, dominating that game and taking a 1-0 series lead, and it looked to be a very easy path to the second round. That was until this grandpa CJ McCollum walked them down, not just in Game 2, but also in Game 3. Back-to-back 1-point victories saw the Hawks take a 2-1 series lead. And overall, the Knicks were showing an inability to close games similar to that Pacers series last year. And overall, the Knicks were starting to panic, and people were starting to think that, yeah, this Knicks team, it was inevitable that they were going to disappoint time and time again. Luckily, in Game 4, they were able to relearn how to play basketball and were able to bounce back, taking it 2-2 back to Madison Square Garden. And in Game 5, they were able to dominate and take a 3-2 series lead, and they finally looked like their former dominant selves. But going into Game 6, there was still some optimism for the Hawks, as we can see that they were very, very resilient. And overall, the Knicks, people were still having some questions around them, so people thought that Game 6 was going to be relatively close. Yeah, I think we should just not talk about that. Round 2 would see the Knicks play against the Philadelphia 76ers. And look, I would go more in depth if there was anything to go in depth with in this series, but this was in the middle of a very, very dominant stretch for the New York Knicks, so they completely destroyed the 76ers. They dominated them in basically every single game, being able to close out Game 2 when it was close, and overall, the Knicks cruised in basically every other game, and in Game 4, the closeout game, yikes. I think the less that we talk about that game, the better. More playoff wins. That would be 6 straight playoff wins now for the New York Knicks. In the Eastern Conference Finals, they would finally play a new opponent, no familiar foes this time. They would face the Cleveland Cavaliers. And in Game 1, they were getting stunned as James Harden and company were leading by 22 going into the fourth quarter, and it looked like the Cavs would steal this game in Madison Square Garden. But then, all of a sudden, the guy for the Knicks, Jalen Brunson, took over in the fourth quarter. He completely rallied off a bunch of points for himself in the fourth quarter, being insanely clutch, going on the stretch, attacking James Harden through and through, and he ended up leading an inspiring comeback for the Knicks to win an improbable overtime victory in Game 1. And that basically mentally shot the Cavs. They were never able to recover, as the Knicks were basically dominant through and through in the entire series. And then for the third time in these playoffs, the closeout game in Cleveland this time, Game 4, was once again extremely ugly. And I think the less that we talk about it, the better. But just like that, the Knicks had reached the NBA Finals following an extremely dominant playoff run, 12-2 in the playoffs with 10 straight victories. And just like that, people were finally taking the Knicks seriously after just bludgeoning their opponents by just 30-point blowouts in the closeout games. And just like that, the Knicks were seen as potentially being the team of destiny to get over the hump and win the NBA Finals, no matter who they played in the Western Conference. So now we are on to the NBA Finals, presented by YouTube TV. And the opponent that they would face in the finals would be none other than their old foe in 1999, the San Antonio Spurs, who had just toppled off the one-seeded reigning champions OKC Thunder, and the Spurs went into the series as being the favorite. But there was a lot of arguments to be made about the Knicks, so this series was going to be an absolute war. Game 1 started, and even though the Spurs were up by double digits earlier in the first half, the Knicks were able to stun San Antonio in San Antonio to steal home court, thanks to a large Jalen Brunson fourth quarter takeover to kind of minimize a pretty poor performance. And overall, the Knicks were able to rally with amazing shooting and their excellent closing ability and stun the Spurs in Game 1. Game 2 was basically more of the same. The Spurs got out to a big lead, this time 14 points in Game 2, but then the Knicks were able to walk them down once again. Another Jalen Brunson fourth quarter takeover was basically enough to seal the Game 2 victory. That and a very stupid turnover by the Spurs to let Jalen Brunson win it on the line. And just like that, in a flash, the Knicks were up 2-0 on the Spurs, both games being in San Antonio, and now they return to Madison Square Garden with a chance to close it out in an improbable sweep. That would be if the Spurs didn't respond in Game 3. Yes, they did blow another lead, this time being up by 14 again, and then almost blowing it in the clutch in the fourth quarter, but the Spurs were able to hold on to the lead for once, knock down some clutch shots, play some clutch defense, and get at least one game in the series, with it being 2-1, and a pivotal Game 4 was now upon us in Madison Square Garden. And the Spurs completely blitzed the Knicks in this game, being up by 29, and it seemed like it would just be a very comfortable win for the Spurs for them to take all the momentum in this game. But then in the second half, the The Knicks just kept chipping and chipping away at this lead. They were knocking down some shots, going on some crazy runs, playing some clutch defense, and overall, it was becoming a closer and closer game as the time was going on. The Spurs were unraveling going into the fourth quarter. Madison Square Garden was going in absolute euphoria, and just like that, the Knicks were able to rally behind in the final minutes to cut the lead and even take the lead at one point. And in the final seconds, Jalen Brunson put up a shot, and then OG Anunoby, in an improbable fashion, tipped the ball back in with barely any time remaining to seal the Game 4 victory. It was the largest comeback in finals history. This brief recap does not do it justice. Go watch the ending. Go watch the highlights. Go watch the game if you can. Overall, Madison Square Garden erupted with joy. The Knicks had officially taken a 3-1 series lead, and the championship seemed inevitable, with now a pivotal Game 5 being for all of the marbles. And for the umpteenth time in this series, the Spurs took a very massive lead, this time being 16 points in the first half, but the Knicks were basically able to cut it down to around 5 at halftime, thanks to them having streaky shooting, and it got into a really close game into the fourth quarter. But of course, for when all the chips were on the table, who else but Jalen Brunson hit another fourth quarter takeover in the series to wrap up an iconic 45-point performance. He lifted the Knicks, basically carried them when the entire supporting cast was not playing well, and he was able to lift the Knicks past the Spurs in Game 5. And just like that, the New York Knicks are your 2026 NBA champions. It wrapped up an insanely dominant and improbable playoff run, them going 16-3. Overall, this is one of the more memorable playoff runs that I've seen in my lifetime. It's just crazy how good the Knicks were able to play in the clutch, dominating teams, and in down the stretching games, just incredible. The Knicks overall have been a franchise that have been in basically eternal failure for the last 50 years. We know all the heartbreaks and just laughter that the Knicks have produced for all the other NBA fans for the better part of 5 decades. And hell, even in this year's playoffs, they were facing some trials and tribulations, with them being down to CJ McCollum of all people. But all those hardships led to this crowning moment, them becoming the 2026 NBA champions, them being able to assemble a team that is extremely complete and extremely likable, players that were doubted in the past that were seen as just afterthoughts, and all of that led to this moment. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your 2026 NBA champions. And that is all I have for you guys today. That is how the Knicks became champions in 2026 and their entire season. Let me know in the comments, what do you guys think about this New York Knicks run? How does it stack up against other teams' playoff runs when they won the championship, and maybe some other teams that didn't win the championship? Let me know in the comments. If you guys enjoyed this video, please subscribe and please like, as any support is truly appreciated. And I will see you guys in the next one.